Chairman of Ways and Means and the Allston-Brighton District City Councilor. Today is my son's birthday, Matthew, April 24th. I'd like to remind folks that this is a public hearing, both being broadcast on RCN Channel 82, Comcast Channel 8, and Verizon 1964, as well as streamed at boston.gov/city-council-tv. I'd like to ask folks in the chamber to silence their electronic devices. At the conclusion of the departmental presentation and questions and answers from my colleagues, we will have public testimony. There's a sign-in sheet to my left by the door. I ask that you state your name, affiliation, and residence, and please check the box if you do wish to testify. I'd like to remind folks also that there are numerous ways for the public to weigh in other than just coming to the chamber, although that's a very great way to do that. There's also a hearing scheduled on Tuesday, June 5th, anytime from 2 to 6 p.m. We will have testimony regarding the entire city budget. You can also send your testimony to the Committee on Ways and Means, Boston City Council, 1 City Hall Plaza, 5th floor, Boston City Hall, Boston 02201, or you can email the committee at ccc.waysandmeans@boston.gov. I'd also like to remind my colleagues the first round, in order to get as much participation, I'm really going to try to keep to a hard 5-minute. It might only allow for one question, but the second round will be 10 minutes in greater detail. We are here with the friends from the Boston Public School Department. I'd like to read the dockets into the record. Dockets 0559 through 0563. Orders for the FY19 operating budget, including annual appropriations for departmental operations, annual appropriation for the school department, appropriation for other post-employment benefits, appropriation for certain transportation and public realm improvements, and appropriation for certain park improvements. Dockets 0564 and 0565, capital budget appropriation, including loan orders and lease and purchase agreements. I'm going to introduce my colleagues in order of their arrival. To my far left, District City Councilor Josh Zakem. To my immediate left, City Councilor at Large Anise Sabi George. To my left again, City Councilor at Large Michelle Wu. To my immediate right, Councilor Kim Janey. And to my left again, Councilor Matt O'Malley. I want to welcome Superintendent, Ellen, Nate, Brian, thank you, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Chairperson Siomo. Good morning, councilors. I want first of all, thank you for your commitment and your advocacy for the young people and families of the city of Boston. I think we all would agree that the young people of Boston Public Schools inspire us each and every single day. Today marks the beginning of our deep engagement with all of you on the proposed fiscal year 19 budget for the Boston Public Schools. We look forward to digging into some of our district's most important issues with you in the coming 2 months. Here in BPS, we believe in the potential of every young person. We believe we must support them so they can reach their fullest potential. We believe that BPS students are the leaders of not only today, but also tomorrow. And the budget for next fiscal year invests in programs and initiatives meant to support their growth, facilitate learning experiences, and will help our students embark on a successful path in college, career, and life. First, this is by far the largest budget in BPS history. At $1.109 billion, it represents a $48 million increase versus the budget you voted on last year. The mayor has increased the BPS budget by $170 million since he took office. The proposed budget makes some key investments in the following areas. Let me name them. Number 1, we're going to invest in the social and emotional health and well-being of our students. 2, we will increase support for our English learners. 3, we will continue our support for our level 3, 4, and 5 schools. 4, we'll transition our centrally funded partnerships in a way that is more equitable. But our budget isn't just about investing in new initiatives, it's also about sustaining great progress we've made. These investments have helped propel BPS on a path for continued improvement over the past few years. Graduation rates are all-time high. We have more students in level 1 and level 2 schools than ever before. And most recently, we demonstrated again strong performance on the National Assessment for Education Progress, otherwise known as NAEP. While BPS remains one of the nation's top performing urban school districts, leading the country in student outcomes, we still have persistent opportunity and achievement gaps. We have to close them so every single student can be successful. This is our mission. It's what drives our work each and every single day. The increase in funding from the city are all more noteworthy because of the challenges we are facing with state funding. Under the governor's proposed budget, net state aid to the city of Boston will fall by $17 million. We thank the mayor for continuing his prioritization of public schools in face of these challenges. With the increase from the city, we were able to accomplish many important priorities. We signed a contract with the Boston Teachers Union last fall that provides a 5% raise for teachers over 2 years. We've made major investment into schools, adding $40 million to school budgets, $30 million for increased wages, and additional $10 million of new dollars so our schools can invest in additional services and supports for our young people. We have heard from the community over the last several months regarding the importance of social and emotional well-being of our students, as well as being part of the national conversation on student safety. It's clear that Sell Well continues to be a priority for us, and that's why we're working with the mayor's team to ensure that the savings that we got from projected costs of health care for next year will be directed towards investments into nurses, social workers, and school psychologists. That number is at $2.4 million. Also, we are focused on supporting our highest need students in our highest need schools, especially ones with declining enrollments, and we have a series of new supports in place for our level 3, 4, and 5 schools with declining enrollments. Also, we've made an additional investment in English language learners this year, including new curriculum materials, professional development for teachers supporting English learners, and a dedicated position within our Opportunity Achievement Gap Office focused on the gaps faced by our immigrant families and EL students. We are also making targeted investments into infrastructure, technology, and innovation. We will be growing programs like Excellence for All and bring in a new program called Becoming a Man, which is a youth development program that supports young Black and Latino males. And we're also investing in data systems for our Office of Human Capital. And I want to close off by mentioning one last thing. This year, we are also piloting initial applications of something we are calling the Opportunity Index. It's a tool that allows us to measure student need. The measure of need is something that is a difficult and it is a challenge in the public policy sector. With this new tool, we are moving the bar on equity. I truly believe we have a national example of how you can measure student need in the context of public schools. It is not a perfect tool, however. It is a starting point for a very important conversation. And this year, you will see 2 initial applications of the Opportunity Index, and we welcome any feedback that you may have about this tool. With that, I'll turn it over to Boston Public Schools Chief Financial Officer, Eleanor Lawrence, who will take you through a presentation and a detailed overview of the proposed budget.
Thank you, Dr. Chang. Good morning, counselors. Thank you for having us this morning. The superintendent touched on a lot of the highlights that we have of our budget here on page 2, so I'll spin through them quite quickly. Again, the FY19 proposed budget for BPS includes a $48 million increase versus what you voted on last year at this time. The total appropriation is over $1.1 billion and represents a $170 million increase during the mayor's tenure. The FY19 proposal is rooted in the guiding principles that were developed by the Budget Equity Work Group, which I'll touch on in a moment. We've really tried to put equity at the center of this budget for our students. As part of that, one of the hallmarks of the budget, as Dr. Chang mentioned, is a $40 million increase in school budgets, again, with a real equity focus in terms of how we distribute and utilize those dollars. I also want to note that the reason we're able to maximize investments in the BPS budget has been because of our commitment to implementing what we call continuous operational efficiencies. We are continually focused on what we can do in central office, in operations, in benefits, to make sure more and more dollars every year go to students. Dr. Chang mentioned that it's as important to us to sustain existing investments as it is to invest in new things. And I just want to highlight here 3 of the pillars of our investment strategy from the last couple of years. These are research-backed strategies that have been recognized with national research about their importance to improving student outcomes. More time learning. You all are familiar with what we call ELT, extended learning time. We have now our elementary schools adding in effect, 20 additional days of school. Early education, having added 725 new K-1 seats in the last 5 years. And a continued emphasis on great teaching. We have teacher salaries at or near the highest offered across the state and the country, and we've reorganized so that we can hire the best teachers early in the year. The BPS budget is certainly large and complex. Every year as we sit here, we try to orient you to what's in it. We think of our budget, broadly speaking, into 3 categories. The first and largest, which you can see here on slide 4 in orange, is the money that we send directly to schools, school budgets. When you include the benefits associated with school budgets, that's about 2/3 of BPS funding. The second largest category is what we call school services budgeted centrally. These are the things that you will see when you walk through schools. They just happen to sit on a central budget. These are things like transportation, some of our special education staff, facility support. And then the smallest category is what we would call central office. The salaries of all 4 of us are included in that category, and that accounts for about 6% of the total BPS budget. Page 5 is a 1-page summary of the budget we are proposing for next school year, broken down along those 3 categories. You can see in the category of direct school expenses that we have an almost 6% increase. This is by far the fastest growing area of our budget, and we've done that intentionally. We want as much money in the hands of our school leaders to implement new services and supports for their students as possible. In the category of school services budgeted centrally, we've worked hard to contain the growth of transportation costs. You'll see there's only one area that's actually decreasing. That's in facilities, as we reflect savings achieved with bringing schools back online for the supply of water. And then in central office administration, I will note that excluding benefits, the central administration overall was only growing by about 1% when we first proposed the budget to the school committee. The more recent increase here of rising by 3% is a reflection that we've captured some of our recently proposed investments in social emotional learning in this category before they get dispersed. Over the last few years, we've spoken to you all about what we call long-term financial planning. I want to touch on it very briefly now. I'll remind you of the process that we used. We started off in the fall of 2016 with publishing a report that we called Investing in Student Support, Investing in Student Success. We intended that report to be the start of a conversation. We laid out a whole bunch of facts and figures, where BPS spends its money, how those costs have increased over time, how we compare to other school districts, and we put out a bunch of ideas for things that we could do to have the future look different for BPS. After that report was released, we had a series of community engagement sessions across the city, and we listened. One of the themes we heard very clearly was there wasn't enough about equity. And so what we did is we created a committee to work with us to think about what does budget equity mean for the Boston Public Schools. It involved members of the Opportunity and Achievement Gap Task Force, as well as members of our Long-Term Financial Plan Advisory Committee. And we worked together over a number of months, and we created this framework. This framework guides how we approach the development of the FY19 budget. It starts this black box on the bottom with a deep commitment, as I mentioned earlier, towards continuous improvement to drive operational efficiency. That's where we start. We layer on top of that making trade-offs and identifying new revenue to fund investments. Those help support the twin goals that you'll see in green of making both system-wide investments as well as school-led investments. What do I mean by each of those? System-wide investments. There are certain things that we believe should come from the central office. Extended learning time is a perfect example. It required contractual negotiations in order to lengthen the school day, and it was a big ticket item. That was what we would call a system-wide investment to lengthen the school day. School-led investments, on the other hand, are places where we think school leaders and their communities are in the best place to make trade-offs and decide what's best for their own kids and their own community. We need to do both. We need to make sure that the central office is driving the system-wide investments and that we've put enough flexible dollars in the hands of school leaders that they can customize their school environment for their kids. All of this takes place on the backdrop, outlined here in blue, of our commitment to increasing the impact of our existing spend. So, where do you see these principles reflected in the FY19 budget? I'm going to take a moment and share some of the highlights. In enabling school-led investments, you'll see, as Dr. Chang mentioned, an initial application of the Opportunity Index with funds specifically to support our highest need students. For instance, we took $5.8 million in historic funding for partners and placed that on school budgets. We also have $3 million in new funding, also allocated with the Opportunity Index, for additional discretionary spending, $3 million for ELL students, and new measures to support schools that have declining enrollment, so that those schools still have some of the flexibility that they need. We've doubled down on our investment to support students experiencing homelessness, adding another $500,000 for a total of almost $2 million. In the category of system-wide investments, as I mentioned earlier, we're continuing to support those 3 research-backed pillars of our investment strategy: extended learning time, early childhood education, and teacher quality. We've added approximately $30 million for increased salaries, $2.4 million for new Cell Well staff, and an additional $1 million for translations and interpretations. In the category of new revenue, again, we thank the mayor for his proposed budget to you that includes a $48 million increase, and we continue to partner with you, the mayor's team, and others in the community to advocate for changes at the state. In increasing the impact of our existing spend, we continue negotiations with our partners in the BTU to define a contract that we believe is great for both students and teachers. We've committed to ongoing improvements in projections, and we partner with schools on student assignment. We've been engaging with the community on Build BPS and what the future looks like there. And we've worked with our special education department on something called multi-tiered systems of support. This helps identify what kids need early in their educational experience before they reach special education. And as I mentioned earlier, we continue always to focus on central office and transportation as areas for potential savings. I'm going to take just a moment to touch on our fiscal environment. Here on page 11, you can see the City of Boston appropriation to BPS from FY14 to FY19. Again, as I mentioned earlier, a $170 million increase. This has come in the face of a complicated state and fiscal landscape. Obviously, our uncertainty and lack of stability continues at the federal level. There's certainly a lot of activity happening as we speak at the state level, and the uncertainty for what that will look like. The governor's proposed budget was not good for Boston and included a lot of challenges. And since 2015, the state's made concerted efforts to grow Chapter 70 by over almost $450 million, but that's translated into almost no new money for Boston. I know we touched on this in the budget breakfast, but it's so important that we wanted to mention it again. This is the visual representation of some of those points I was just making. The bottom two lines here, Chapter 70, education aid, and charter school reimbursement, have been basically stagnant for Boston, while you can see the top two lines, the City of Boston BPS spending and the City of Boston overall education spending, which includes charter schools, continue to grow steadily. The last topic I'll touch on are our proposed investments for next year. You'll find the full list of our investments here on page 15. We've broken them into the two categories that I mentioned in our framework a few moments earlier, system-wide investments and school-led investments. We've touched on a few of these already, $2.4 million for Selwell, an additional $1 million in translations and interpretations. We'll grow into its third year a pilot we call Excellence for All. We'll be adding sixth grade to that program with an additional $700,000. Becoming a Man, as the superintendent mentioned, for $500,000. We're excited about the Lynch Leadership Program, which is a pipeline for school leaders with an additional $300,000. We'll be making a series of curriculum investments also for $300,000. We're adding 2 additional custodians and 2 additional police officers, a new data system for teacher evaluation, and radios for school police. The $10 million in additional discretionary spending at the school level is outlined here. We have further investment in school budgets for high-need students of $3 million. I mentioned that earlier. Those are the same funds distributed by the Opportunity Index. We have $3 million in additional funds for ELL students, $500,000 of additional funds for students experiencing homelessness. We've added new soft landings for schools with declining enrollment at 2.6, and a reserve for lower performing schools of an additional $1 million. I'll touch very briefly on some of the highlights of those investments before I wrap up. Our $2.4 million investment that's proposed in Selwell includes 8 nurses, 7 psychologists, 4 social workers, and a director of social work. Dr. Chang talked to you a little bit about how we fund partners today. This is probably worth touching on for a moment. It's a question I'm sure will come up. I want to first explain how the model works today. We are not talking about all partners who work in the Boston Public Schools, of which there are many, many. We are talking about a specific pool of money that funded 13 specific partners. It was a legacy system that had been rolled over for many years. They were, and the schools happened to have been chosen when those partners began working with the Boston Public Schools. Who picks the partners? It was mostly the central office behind the wheel on this one. And we didn't have formal supports in place to make sure that the partnerships always went well. Again, this was a specific $5.8 million pot of money. So our proposal for how things change next year is to take that same pot of money but allocate it to the schools where the students are highest need. Second, we want to put the decision-making in the hands of school leaders. They are the ones who are going to be in the school observing the service delivery. We believe they are best positioned to understand if the partner is delivering services that are valuable to that school community. In addition, we're going to offer a slew of new supports to make sure that schools are making informed decisions and that we help them with the administrative burden of actually going through the partnership and creating the MOU. The amount of money that we're spending on partners isn't changing. It might be spent in different schools, and schools might select different partners, but in fact, I think we're going to end up spending more on partners when this is said and done because we're really beefing up the communications that can exist between schools and prospective partners out there in our Boston community. As Dr. Chang referenced, we have been working on for over a year a new tool to develop to understand where our kids in BPS are the highest need. we've developed what we call the Opportunity Index. It is really a natural evolution of the tools that we have in our arsenal today to understand where need is. Like other major school districts, we've historically relied on things like which of our students are low income, which of our students may have fallen off track by the time they get to high school. Those measures have been a little bit blunt for us historically. And so we've been part of national conversations about how do we get better at using data in innovative ways to tell us more about who our kids are and where are the kids who really need help. The Opportunity Index is our first shot at doing that. It relies heavily on the old measures, but it's a natural evolution to use some more data. We're looking at the neighborhoods that students live in. How much crime is there in the neighborhood that the student lives in? What are the public health issues in this neighborhood the student lives in? And we're folding those into our existing measures, like poverty, like off-track status. As we mentioned, we are proceeding with some care here. This is a new tool. We don't want to move too quickly, but this reallocation of the partnership dollars is one of the places where we wanted to first apply it. So you can see here on page 19, I mentioned that we had some legacy relationships. There wasn't necessarily a clear relationship before of need and where we were spending those partnership dollars. The graph on the right shows that we've cleaned that up and that we are really sending the money now to, we believe, the highest need students. There are a couple outliers on the graph on the right, but those were intentional for various reasons, like protecting schools that were level 4 and 5, et cetera. Just touching in closing on our last few investments, we're really pleased to be growing Excellence for All into its 3rd year, so it will now serve 6th graders, so we'll have 4th, 5th, and 6th. This is a program that's all about increasing enrichment and rigor in those critical middle years. Our funds for supporting students experiencing homelessness, you can see here on page 21 how those resources have been used in the current school year and some of our successes so far. And lastly, we'll leave you with some information on this new program, which we'll be rolling out to a number of our high schools called BAM, or Becoming a Man. It's a school-based group counseling program that specifically supports young men of color and has some very exciting research about the impact it's been able to have. So I hope that overview of our budget was helpful. As Dr. Chang said at the beginning, this marks the start of a conversation with you all, and we welcome your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And shortly after you started your presentation, we were joined by Councilor Tim McCarthy, Councilor Ed Flynn, and Councilor Lydia Edwards. Wanted to just talk a little bit about revenue, and you touched on the challenges with Chapter 70 in particular, but just net state aid specifically. You know, I'm looking at a graph that I received where I guess the governor's proposed budget increases Chapter 70 by under 0.6%. And if there was anything that we should and could change about how they formulate that, what would that be for us?
You've heard us say this before. Chapter 70 doesn't work for Boston.
Right.
In a nutshell, it was a very progressive approach 20 years ago to state education finance. The state tries to look at where's the need in the state and where is the wealth. And Boston, as I was saying to you before the hearing began, is unique in that across the Commonwealth, we are the district that stands out as being extremely high need, but they also say we're wealthy. And so the reason that it's broken for us is when they pour more money in, we don't get any of it because we still keep getting our minimum aid. The number one thing that I think has bang for the buck for us at the state level is the charter reimbursement. So you asked what's the one thing. If there's one thing that I could wave a magic wand and do, it would be that the state fulfills its obligation on charter reimbursement. When the charter law was written, the state acknowledged that there are transition costs for districts. it put into law a formula of what those transition funds should be, and that has been regularly underfunded, disproportionately affecting Boston.
And is it this year that is the highest year that we're going to have to do the reimbursements?
Our charter assessment is at historic highs. It keeps going up and up every year. The gap between what we are owed and what we are getting, I anticipate will be high this year, but of course that number hasn't been settled, and there are indications it might not be quite as bad as it was under the governor's proposal, but I believe that conversation is active right now at the state level.
Right. I believe you're right about the charter school reimbursements being the biggest pot of money. It was an obligation made, much like the obligation to pay Quinn, which now the city is
Yes.
picking up the entire 100%. It dismays me when I'm looking at, and not to pick on our suburban neighbors and friends, but Belmont gets an increase of almost 14% in Chapter 70 funding. Now, in real dollars, it's not a ton of money. It's $1.5 million, but they're a very much smaller community. I would urge that we all look at applying more of a weighted student formula method of who we're educating in our cities and towns, and particularly in our urban settings, to be more fairly reflective of the equity needed in this kind of funding. So I just wanted to kind of go on record in that space, because I think we're getting very much shortchanged on that, and so on our students. So with that, I will pass it on to Councilor George Sakam stepped out. Councilor Nisasabi George.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, again, and thank you all, Superintendent, Eleanor, Nate. David, I'm sorry, David, I know David, for being here today. I have a number of questions, and I thought Josh was here, so I got to just get my notes here together. Just generally, when we talk about the reduction in state aid, we talk about the lack of support from the feds, the continued support from the feds and the state on educational assistance in particular. What is it that we're able to do as a city, as a school department, as a city council, to do a better job advocating for better support from those partners?
I think the number one opportunity for us is to engage at the state level. Certainly our voice is needed in Washington, D.C. as well, but we need to make clear the sentiment that Councilor Siomo just raised about how broken Chapter 70 is for Boston, and we need that voice to be loud and unified. That would be my number one ask to the council.
And that's something that we're I think, very happy as a group to participate in. I think we just need that, sort of that direction, that encouragement. Great. I do want to thank you, thinking about the time since my first budget for fiscal year 17 to now, the continued increase in investment in helping our students who are facing homelessness, the investment last year, the increase in that investment for this year. I am curious about the ways that, if we could just sort of do a high-level rundown of the ways that schools have chosen to invest some of that funding, and where we see the improvements for next school year.
So the biggest investment has been in people and support at the school level to work with children who are experiencing homelessness. We've tried to put a real emphasis on having those staff be a bridge to other local and state services that exist to help families. So we're trying not to always recreate the wheel in BPS, but to have people who know how to help create those connections. The second biggest category of spending has been in stuff to help students who don't have the basic needs to be prepared to come to school every day. That's in the category of, we call it basic supplies there on slide 21. We've had a number of schools that have set up clothing and supply closets. They've helped with uniform and school supplies. Those are some of the highlights.
Great. Right.
And we have a team, sorry to interrupt, we have a team who's been working with it, with schools on it, and I would love to put them in touch with you. And
Well, I think
wanna,
we'll get a more detailed
Yeah,
presentation
absolutely.
during that segment of the budget, but I just want to have an opportunity to highlight it, as we look at the budget and where we're choosing to invest some of our resources. About just looking at sort of the additional investments that are happening for this year, I see that we're investing $700,000 in Excellence for All, rolling it up to the 6th grade. Can we talk a little bit about the relationship between Excellence for All and advanced work classrooms? And is that reflected in a decrease in advanced work?
We have not made any reductions to AWC from a central point of view. We have had at some schools a lack of demand for a couple of our AWC programs, which has affected what the delivery looks like at the school level. That is not a reflection of any policy decisions we've made, but merely a continuation of some changing enrollment patterns and demand from families.
One quick point. Since the beginning of the implementation of Excellence for All, we are seeing that there's a lot less mobility in our elementary schools that are offering Excellence for All. So families are choosing to keep their students in the school where they're attending after 3rd grade. And I think that's stability, and lessening of transitions is important for families and communities.
And then in the presentation for today, I think this is slide 20, the data on how kids are able to access, the percentage of kids that are able to access Excellence for All compared to AWC. It's the same data as last year's presentation, so I wonder when we get down to the academics portion later in the series of hearings, if we could have, I guess, updated data just to see how many kids are able to access it compared to AWC.
We have also committed to a full research study on Excellence for All because next year will be our 3rd year, and we'll have all 4th through 6th grade. And so we'll have really robust data moving into next year as well.
Great. And then just for this round, I see that there's an investment in a new data system for teacher evaluation. What was wrong with the old system, and what major changes will we see in our schools, or will teachers see in our schools based on that new data system?
The old system was known as EDFS. That might sound familiar to you. We had developed it internally a number of years ago. It had trouble keeping up with the volume and
it crashed all of the time?
Yes. It crashed all the time. It was offline at critical times when it was needed to be used. I believe that our Office of Human Capital has already put out an RFP to select new technology that would be from a third-party vendor.
Okay. So how many different, and one of the concerns, I'll just say this and then we'll move on because I'm hitting my 5-minute mark, just a lot of systems that we use in our schools, whether it's for the teacher evaluation tool, whether it's the SIS for attendance and grade reports, and then the IEP system. There's just a lot of different places and sort of portals that teachers need to access, and school administrators and parents need to access for information. It gets really confusing. It creates sort of a tangled web and creates a very not easily accessible for anybody system.
You're absolutely correct. Boston Public Schools is part of national conversations around interoperability. All school systems face this challenge where there are so many data systems, but the goal is hopefully over the next few years that there are systems in place that ensure that all those things actually talk to each other. But it's a big national conversation. I just came back from a conference where we specifically talked about that issue.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councilor Janey.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and welcome, Dr. Chang and members of your team. This is a little odd for me, kind of a role reversal. Usually I'm the one testifying before you in the school committee, and now here you are in the city council chamber. As you know from my previous testimony and my years of advocacy, my focus really has been around equity and how we are moving forward in eliminating opportunity and achievement gaps. I thank you for your commitment to that, and would love to kind of drill down on some of the areas, particularly with the opportunity index. And if you could talk about that on some of the school committee meetings that I attended. There was testimony from parents and school educators who thought that it worked well, and then we heard from others who were really concerned about getting less resources for their schools. So if you could just drill down a little and tell me a little bit more about how that's working.
Okay, I'll start. Thank you, Councilor Janey, and thank you for being a champion on issues of equity. The Opportunity Index is our first attempt at a tool to be more nuanced in the way we measure need. Typically, as Eleanor stated, need is we look at data points such as whether a student is an EL student, special education, low income. Those are typical demographic data points that we look at to determine student need in school systems. We know that need is a lot more nuanced than that. We know, especially for our young people in earlier grades, neighborhood factors have immense correlation with student performance. And in upper grades, previous school performance is added on top of neighborhood factors. So based on that assumption, and based on that research-backed assumption, I should say, we worked with BARI to create the Opportunity Index. And the Opportunity Index looks at factors in two different buckets. One bucket is neighborhood factors, such as crime rates, such as socioeconomic status, such as physical disorder of the public spaces in neighborhoods. We look at academic attainment of adults in neighborhoods. All that data is all census data. It's publicly available, and we attach it to a census. All that data is attached to a specific census tract. We also have, for our secondary students, we looked at previous school performance as well, how well they perform in English and math in their middle school years. With all that data combined, we basically stack ranked from 0 to 1 all the schools in Boston Public Schools. And it really does pressure test with what we know about schools. So a school like the Carter School has a 0.892 Opportunity Index. The King School has a 0.739 Opportunity Index. And kind of on the other end of the spectrum, you have Boston Latin at 0.157 and Elliott School at 0.174. Based on that Opportunity Index, we now have a sense of need of the young people in schools throughout Boston.
So can I ask a question?
Yes.
In terms of the schools with the greatest need, if you looked at the top 10% with the greatest need, are they concentrated in a certain area of the city, in a particular neighborhood?
Yes. Roxbury, Dorchester are the primary neighborhoods. And that's all based on census tract data. I will say that it is not a perfect tool, and we have already started a process refining this tool. We don't want perfect to be the enemy of the good here, and we wanted something to get started with, because we know the way we fund schools is not necessarily equitable. And just to kind of give you an interesting data point, we used the Opportunity Index to allocate partnership dollars, as Eleanor's talked about, $5.8 million of centrally funded partnerships, and we allocate out to schools. And when we look at specific demographic groups and how that changed because of this new funding formula, with our partnership dollars this year, they went to schools that were 83% socially, economically disadvantaged, 46% Black, and 43% Hispanic, and that's all above the district average.
I appreciate you. My last question during this round, given the concentration in certain neighborhoods, where are we in terms of the equity analysis of the home-based plan? So I know this has been an ongoing issue ever since that plan has been adopted. The concerns that many parents and advocates raised back then is by locking folks into closer to home would then limit their opportunity to attend schools that had better quality, and it seems that that is proving true by the data that you shared earlier in terms of the census. So just where are we in terms of getting that underway so that we can really understand what the impact has been, what lessons have been learned, and where to go from here.
The study, the public reporting out of the study will happen in June. We've already had some initial data that was shared for feedback about a month ago, but the final presentation will be in June.
And is that available, that a month ago, the report out that you did? Because I haven't seen it.
We can get it to you.
I appreciate that.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr.
Councilor
Chair.
O'Malley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Your team, I do see my dear friend whom we miss desperately at the English High School, Dr. Ligia Noriega Murphy, who's doing a great job in your cabinet, Superintendent. So, although we do miss her at English, but we're glad that she's still serving the students of Boston. A couple of brief questions for our first round. The first, if you go through sort of the department history, the line item in your budget books. So overall, it's about a $16.5 million increase over last year's budget.
Sorry, excuse.
The increase over last year's budget is about $16.5 million.
So there are, I've tried to choose my words carefully here. We had a mid-year supplemental, as you know, for the BTU.
Yep.
Which $48 million includes the 16.5 that you just mentioned, plus 31 and change, which was the BTU supplemental. We frankly had some debates about how to talk about it and display the data. Given that the rising salaries is far and away the largest cost of that it's the largest item that eats up rising revenue, we wanted to make sure that we included that as part of the discussion, because this is the time of year when we get a lot of focus on the budget, and we felt like putting it to the side would lose the attention on that it deserves.
Okay, so it is correct to say that $16.5 million increase over the total FY18 appropriation, which includes the 31 million in salary adjustments for the contract.
And I will also note that we don't currently have a contract for 19, and so the 16 million is rising costs, assuming
I didn't mean this to be such a
I
tough
know
question.
it's the reason you are correct, absolutely.
Okay.
And I just want to note that the 16.5 will go up when the next collective bargaining agreement is reached.
Right, and I know we can't get into too many specifics, but generally, how would you characterize sort of negotiations for the new contract?
We are in active negotiations with the BTU, and our goal is always to have a contract settled before the current one expires.
Fair enough. Okay, thank you. So going back to the earlier point, if you look at the budget sheet, increases all around, with the exception of under current charges and obligations and equipment. There's a $1.6 million decrease that seems to come from reserve account. Can you talk a little bit about that? Is that talking about pension liabilities stuff, or? It's line item, if you have your book open, 54800.
Our reserve accounts are not reserves for, they're reserves that are designated for specific purposes that we plan to liquidate throughout the year. That's why we end the year with our reserves at zero.
Okay.
Last year, we had a number of things in reserve when our budget was approved, including planned transportation costs. We always start the year with weighted student funding reserve in anticipation of students arriving in the fall. That's the biggest section of our reserve.
So I'm sorry to cut you off, Nate, but this is interesting because if just walk me through FY16 expense 0, FY17 expense 0, FY18 appropriation 24 million, FY19. So that's a significant. So is that money that was used to then pay?
Yeah, throughout the year, that money is transferred out of the reserve account and into the accounts from which we'll spend it. The largest portion of that being teachers and paraprofessionals that are.
So did that $31 million come partially from that amount last year for the contract?
No, that $31 million for the teacher contract is reserved on the city side.
Okay.
And then is added to our budget as a supplemental appropriation throughout the year. So these reserves are reserves that we hold. They're more management reserves. Identified expenses that we plan to expend, but for which we haven't identified either the school or department within within BPS that will actually manage the expenditures. And so the example that I keep going back to is every year we predict how many students we're going to serve, and we try and do our best to identify which schools, programs, and grades they're going to be in. We hold back a certain reserve knowing that there's a portion of our enrollment that's just unpredictable. In the fall, the students arrive, or as we start to see assignment data, and then we start to allocate those reserves out to schools, and we've already started to liquidate some of this reserve so that we can make sure that teachers and paraprofessionals are there to serve the kids when they arrive.
That makes total sense. How did you, and you should have that sort of flexibility because things obviously can change in the middle of a school year, but how did you access funds to address those problems before last year, before fiscal year 18?
They were budgeted, so this is, the difference in this chart is 16 and 17 are expenditure data, and 18 and 19 are the budgeted amounts.
I see.
So as we allocate the money from the budget line item of a reserve to a specific, in most cases, it ends up in the permanent employees line for either
I see.
paraprofessionals or teachers.
So if this were to have more detail and we had FY16 appropriation, FY16 expenditure, we would see roughly $20-ish million thereabouts.
That's right.
Okay, that's helpful.
Although I would say that the expenditure, the budget for our reserve accounts
Okay.
did go up because of the extended learning time. We hold that money that we're going to pay for extended learning time in a reserve, so it increased the year that we did larger extended learning time. We rolled out Schedule A to more schools.
Okay,
So 16 would be a smaller amount
I see. Okay.
because of ELT.
We'll get back to that in my next round. Thank you, Mr.
Thanks.
Chairman.
Counselor Flynn.
Thank you, everybody, for giving me the opportunity to ask a few questions. Superintendent, I know you highlighted some of the factors in determining the budget would include social, economic issues, including poverty. I had the opportunity to visit Tufts University a week ago, and we were talking about public health issues in Chinatown especially. But how is that factored in terms of possibly doing more outreach to students that don't speak English or their parents especially? Are there any specific programs that you could highlight that we could kind of bridge the gap for non-English speaking parents and students?
So this year, we made an additional investment in translation services.
$1 million.
Yeah, $1 million in additional translation services. And that's on top of what do we have right now?
I think that brings our total to 3. I can get the number.
We'll get that number for you, what it brings it a total to.
Okay.
And that's to support translation services, not only for IEPs, but for parent meetings, for engagement with the community.
And how is the interaction with the parents that don't speak English needing translators to communicate with their teachers, checking on the status or progress of a student?
Yeah. I think that's always a challenge, and as much as possible, we try to build a capacity. Schools try to build a capacity within their own schools, but we do have resources centrally that can be allocated to schools and delivered to schools when needed. In schools in your council district, the Quincy, for example, I know that they have capacity at their school sites to do some level of translation, but additional support will always be important.
And I know there was a mention in the budget about the Quincy School. There was some funding possibly doing a study of looking at long-term plans of the school, possibly building a new school. Do you have any updates on that?
I don't have any updates, but I know that there are capital, in our capital presentation, we might be able to get into some more details.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just to follow up on the first part, the total budget for translation services in the FY19 proposed budget is $3.7 million.
And with that money, we'll be ensuring that every written communication that goes to a family about their student is in their home language.
Okay. Yeah, one concern I have is I just want to make sure that we communicate effectively with the parents also that may not speak English. That's a big issue in my district, so I just want to stay on top of that and advocate for those types of services.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
as it relates to the $2.4 million investment for nurses, psychologists, social workers, can you expand on that? In terms of the nurses, will each school have its own nurse? Will some schools have to share a nurse? And if they are sharing, or if they're not sharing, can we get any nurses or psychologists in, certainly other languages other than English as well?
We are, as we mentioned, adding 8 nurses. We have not yet reached the stage where we can have a full-time nurse in every school. We are pleased that our recent contract with the BTU raised the minimum staffing for our nurse in every school to 0.5. So we now have at least a 0.5 in every school. And with adding 8 more, we're getting closer and closer to having more complete nursing coverage. I appreciate your sentiment on the language skills that we have of the staff that we're hiring in this category. Our school committee has also encouraged us to focus on that, and it will be a big priority as we hire these staff and fill these positions.
And I would also just highlight, I think it was 3 weeks ago that the Office of Human Capital held a career fair for recruiting people with multiple language abilities. So for all positions, not just teaching positions, there was an effort to specifically reach out and recruit people who could speak multiple languages and are in these positions. So, and at our hearing for human capital, they can talk more about that.
What type of outreach would you do on that issue in regards to Cantonese speaking or Mandarin speaking medical professionals?
I can't speak to that specifically, but I'll take note of that and ask Emily Kazelbush, our Assistant Superintendent for Human Capital, follow-up on that.
And I guess I have 2 more questions, but I was wondering, Superintendent, if there's a way, if there's a certain checklist that you could establish to ensure schools sign off on a public safety plan, making sure that the school is 100% in compliance with your guidelines, with Boston Police guidelines, in ensuring that evacuations are addressed, public safety issues are addressed, communication with parents, communication with Boston Police. Is there a certain checklist that you go over, making sure that the school is 100% in compliance on public safety related issues?
We do. Our Office of Safety leads that effort. We are actually about to complete an audit of every single school, the physical plan, every single school, looking at secured doorways, looking at doors that lock, and that will be completed shortly. Also, our schools go through safety drills every single year. There are checklists that school administrators have to go through during those drills as well.
How is the dialogue with Boston Police, school police, yourself? How often are you having those meetings talking about public safety issues?
The Office of School Safety was created 2 years ago, and the responsibility of that office is to coordinate across all city agencies around issues of school safety. So that's happening constantly.
Counselor.
Thank you, Superintendent.
Thank you, Counselor Flynn. Counselor Edwards.
I just had a couple questions. I really appreciate, first of all, the amount of work I know that you've done in our district, in District 1, in East Boston, Charlestown, and the North End. And you had mentioned during your presentation that you were working on a soft landing for schools whose populations are declining. I know East Boston High School does have that issue, so you could tell me what that means by a softer landing.
Yeah, actually, David Bloom is our budget director. I'd love for him to talk you through how this process works.
Excuse me. At East Boston High School in specific, to use an example, what they're seeing is their incoming 9th grade and 10th grade cohorts are smaller than they've historically been. And that means sort of 2 different things for the school. One is you need fewer 9th grade English classes because there's just fewer kids. And that you can adjust relatively easily without impacting the students who remain. right? You can still keep the same class size, just offer slightly fewer sections, adjust your budget. Not that there aren't impacts of that, but you can sort of make that work. The other part of a challenge when you see a reduced student enrollment is that you also see a reduction in your total discretionary budget, because that's a per pupil number, and as you have fewer pupils, there's less discretionary funding. What we do is we sort of estimated that for a school experiencing reduced enrollment, typically that's somewhere around 20% of that reduced funding is coming from discretionary supports. And so that's what we're targeting with our soft landings. We're not trying to maintain empty English classes. What we're trying to do is make sure that the social work supports, guidance supports, other sort of supplemental services are still there for students. So at East Boston in particular, I'd have to look up their specific intervention, but I know what the headmaster was thinking about in particular was guidance and some elective courses, making sure that he could maintain those elective options for students. And that's where his soft landing was focused.
So when you say discretionary, what's a typical discretionary thing for a school?
So a school has discretion over the number of guidance counselors they have. They have discretion over the number of social workers they have. They have discretion over certain types of additional coursework beyond the core curriculum.
Okay.
And usually family and community engagement is another area where we see
School administration.
school administration as well. They can, yeah.
I had a question about private funding and partnerships that schools are trying to create in order to also supplement their budget. And I'm really curious. I know, for example, the Elliott School has been excellent at being able to leverage a lot and raise funding in the area a lot due to the fact that the kids who go there and their parents might have higher incomes on average. So they're able to raise maybe $100,000 at a fundraiser. And so how does that, or how, do you guys calculate how, in terms of equity, if a school is able to leverage that much private dollars from parents to support that elementary school, and then let's say over at the Umana, they're getting rid of Tenacity, which is an incredibly popular program. They can't afford to keep it, but those kids would love to have it. So how is it, when you look at the budget numbers, do you see that, and do you compensate in some way?
So what you are discussing underscores the importance of the opportunity index and what dollars we do have at central office. We want to make sure those schools that have the most need get those dollars. We also have our office of.
But do you look at the private funding that the schools are able to raise on their own as part of the, okay, so.
We're changing our policies this year to request reporting on that from all of our schools. So we haven't had perfect visibility historically. I can't guarantee it's going to be perfect going forward, but we'll be implementing a new policy where we request reporting on that from any 501c3 or parent organization associated with the school as of this spring.
That's excellent. That's excellent. And then just again, I want to appreciate the immense amount of work and the increase in the budget for helping ELL students and families. I know in East Boston and even Charlestown, we have some of the highest populations of ELL families. I am curious about whether the bilingual education bill that just passed that allows for different ways of educating in one language or not, is that an unfunded mandate on our schools? Is that actually been helpful to our schools? How does that impact schools?
So we're just in the beginning of exploring how that look bill will provide us the flexibility in programming for our EL students. Bilingual education is a huge priority for us, and we created a Haitian Creole program, the first of its kind for early education.
That's great.
And we plan on opening a Mandarin dual immersion program over the next couple of years. We're also in exploration of other languages as well, but more importantly, how we serve our EL students in specific types of classroom environments, there will be more flexibility on that moving forward. So we're in the very beginning stages of determining what the look bill can do to help support young people in Boston.
Yeah, just to, again, give credit where credit's due at the Omana, having that Spanish track has been actually a pull for a magnet to the school for a lot of folks who want to go there. And I do know that they've actually adjusted some of their special education to also be in Spanish.
That's right.
So I commend, and I think it's great. So thank you for your hard work.
Thank you. Councilor Flaherty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to maybe touch base on that. The reference was to discretionary, so I'm assuming that that's school site autonomy and giving sort of principals the discretion, if you will, and the tools that they need as they're sort of seeing things unfold within their school site. That's fair to say?
That's correct.
And that's something obviously I've supported from day one, giving our principals the autonomy to make those decisions as they're seeing fit for their school. That said, we also need to hold those principals accountable. Not quite sure what we're doing on that front to make sure that we're holding the principals accountable for the decisions that they're making with respect to the student body that's attending their school. Because at some point we have to get around talking about academic excellence. We talk about all these extraneous issues. It's become a business. We continue to see the budget numbers increase every single year. We do have a lot of success stories within the Boston Public Schools to celebrate and to talk about. But I think we sometimes get caught up in some of the semantics and some of the minutiae as opposed to realizing that we're in a global economy and everyone else seems to be kind of going right by us. And so I'd love to hear about academic excellence. I'd like to talk about celebrating the success stories that we have and then also recognizing some of our deficiencies and bringing those schools up to par and beyond so that we can provide an education for the next generation that will be competing in the global economy. Lots of stuff, lots of great things happen in our city. All these companies want to come here. We boast of having the best colleges and universities in the world in Boston, and want to make sure that the kids that attend the Boston Public Schools have opportunities and access to those great colleges and universities, but also to be able to jump right into the workforce. And it seems like every year we're inviting tens of thousands of students from all over the world to come to Boston to get a great education. Years past, they actually used to get the diploma across the stage and then get back on a plane and head back to where they came from. Many of those folks are now staying because the economy is so great and obviously the job market's great. But yet if you're living in the neighborhoods of Boston or you're attending the Boston Public Schools or you're living in public housing, you drive by those companies, you see and read all the activity that's happening, but you don't have access and you're not able to participate because you can't compete. So I really want to start to focus around academic excellence. I've had the beneficiary of attending public schools, also went to BC High and BC and BU Law, and it was all about academic excellence. And I hope that our approach to educating the children of Boston will start to focus on academic excellence and allow these kids to compete. So that's sort of right out of the gate. That's tied into discretionary funding. Second, if we can just touch base on that overtime, you guys have a sort of a 5-year snapshot, a 5-year analysis of the overtime. If you can just kind of maybe touch on that as to where that's coming from, what does that mean, what are the trends that you're seeing? And then third, like my colleagues, I was listening in my office, we're concerned about the cuts to state aid, but there doesn't seem to be a real like sort of formalized, organized campaign. And I'm going to ask you guys, potentially BPS, to lead that effort along with our mayor and the city council to get that message up to Beacon Hill that those cuts are devastating to the capital city here. And we're asking them to reconsider that. Those are important funds for us to educate our children, to put the best product we can online. But it seems like we're in separate silos. City council's advocating, we'll do a resolution. Working it your way. Obviously, the mayor is exercising his leadership, but I think that if we were able to come together, the mayor, the Boston City Council, the Boston School Committee, as well as BPS leaders, and literally formalize an organized effort up at Beacon Hill, hopefully we might be able to turn the dime on that a little bit and be able to get some more funds from state aid. So those are sort of my 3 issues as we're doing an overview. Thank you, Superintendent.
Thank you.
So
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, the question on the overtime?
Yep.
So our overtime history includes in it what we refer to as our stipend accounts. And stipends are amounts given to employees for specific work outside of their job description, which for teachers is usually paid at a contractual hourly rate. The stipends can include extra tutoring work. It can include support for after-school programs. It can include teacher leadership stipends. There's a whole array of types of stipends that schools give out. A lot of the decisions around stipends are made at the school level for school-specific programs and needs. The other thing that is included in the stipend amount, the overtime amount, is a particular category of extended learning time payments for our pilot schools and some of our turnaround schools. We have a number of different ways in which the day is extended in our district. Schedule A is what we refer to as the latest negotiation, which is part of the employees, the teachers' salaries. In other cases, we pay it via stipend. And so you see pretty steady trends in terms of the amount that we've expended over the last few years in stipends. And in terms of overtime, we do have overtime for custodians. It's something that we, it's usually done in the summer to prepare schools for the fall semester. And so you'll see a lot of overtime work being done then to ready our schools and do projects to get the schools open for the fall.
Can you just tell me, could you explain to me, like, what's an external FTE? And then if you've noticed, I've noticed there's been a drop in the external FTEs from, say, 600 to 545. So we've dropped, 50, arguably 55 external FTEs, but the overall number has gone up, 300,000.
So in this case, the external FTEs refers to FTEs that are paid on external funds or grants. So our large grants, including our entitlement grants, those are the FTEs included in that category. When we do budgeting and we work with schools, schools are often taking an all funds approach, meaning they're just looking at their total dollars and trying to make decisions around where and how to budget particular positions. Two things have led to schools moving positions off of general funds off of external funds and onto general funds. The first is external funds offer flexibility for use in contracts and supplies. So as they start to think about how they want to spend their money, whether it's on Title I or whether or not it's on their general fund appropriation, they're thinking about having more flexibility on Title I for supplies and things like that. The other thing is we have a policy that our external fund, positions funded on external funds for schools, they need to pay for benefits. As part of it, it's a way to sort of control our FTE expansion overall, so that as schools get more dollars allocated through new things like the Opportunity Index, that they sort of recognize the full cost of positions when they add it and the full liability to the city. As a result, schools will often move positions off of external funds and onto general funds to make sure that they aren't incurring the extra cost of benefits.
So then why would less external FTEs be costing more money? One would think that less external FTEs would mean less money. So we have sort of a reverse.
It's less money for less external means less money for the school, the way that we do benefits. So they can, if at one FTE is sitting on their external funds, they pay the benefits for that employee.
Okay.
If it's funded through general funds, we pay for the benefits as part of it. It's just a practice that we have at BPS.
I have some information requests, actually. We have approximately 125 schools in the system. Could you provide us with the breakdown of number of level 1, 2, 3, 4s, and 5s? I would also ask we talked a little bit about staffing level, just 5 to 7 year trend of staffing levels, both in external and operational.
Counselor, I believe the staffing level numbers that you are looking for is in the packet under the FTE. I'm trying to find the exact page. Under the personnel information, 5-year analysis of full-time FTEs, those are actual employees, not budgeted positions. So that shows your staffing levels over the last 5 years.
Great.
Is that what you're looking for?
Yeah, yes. Okay. Can you talk a little bit about, as we approach the end of the school year, the excess pool and how we're managing that?
Yes, and when our Office of Human Capital is here, they'll have a lot more data, but we are in our second year of working very closely with finance and the Office of Human Capital to make sure that we can keep everything that has been good about our early hiring initiative while containing the costs. And so at this time of year, the Office of Human Capital is watching very closely what they call PPAs, program placement areas. And so they'll look at how many open positions we have, say, in computer teachers, how many open positions we have, how many internal candidates we have, and they make a judgment as the year goes on of when to close each PPA to external hiring. And the introduction of that practice last year at this time, we're in our third year of it. We're in our third year of it now. 2 years ago at this time really helped contain the cost of the early hiring initiative. It's not without some implications for our schools, where they would have loved to have a choice between an internal and an external candidate up until the last minute. But it allows us to still allow open hiring to internal and external candidates from the time the job is posted, while shrinking the size of the excess pool somewhat.
Right. So we are attempting to manage that
Absolutely.
better. Yeah.
And in our FY17 budget, we had proposed a reduction of a couple $1 million in the early hiring budget. We've realized that successfully for 3 years in a row now, and I think retained, as I said, the real benefits of the program.
Right. Okay. And I believe this was asked yesterday, but just for the record, no plans for any consolidations or closings in the FY19 budget?
We have one school
Right.
that is
Yeah.
being proposed for school closure. Dorchester Academy was
Right.
previously a level 5 school. The school now has 16 students. The vast majority of young people that were enrolled at the beginning of the year have graduated from the school. That school will close at the end of the year.
Right. And there's like a handful of students
We have,
left.
I believe we have 16 students. left at
16,
this-
okay. And the $2.4 million investment in SEL, Selwell, could you give us a breakdown? Is that staff members? Is that programming? What is the $2.4 million?
Our current plan is for that to be entirely BPS staff. The list of the staff are in the first page of the investments section. Thank you. 8 nurses, 7
gotcha.
psychologists, 4 social workers, and a director of social work.
Great.
I will say we are still a little bit early in the implementation of the $2.4 million, and I do want to make sure that we're having dialogue with our wonderful Boston partners, but our plans at this point is for them to be BPS staff.
Great. And I know in my neighborhood, we have a great community health center that partners with several of our elementary schools in K-8. So, and lastly, information again. Can you give me like a 5-year window of enrollment by grade?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's it. Counselor Asabi George.
Thank you, Chair. I have a few questions to follow up on my colleagues' questions, and I think this might be an interesting one for information for either the Selwell hearing that will be upcoming. But where we have our nurses, less than 1 nurse in a school building for next school year, I am curious about the health needs of the children in that school. I'm a proponent of 1 full-time nurse in every school building, and understanding that some of our schools have multiple or a spread out campus. But I am interested in any of the health needs, the serious chronically ill students that might be in our buildings that don't have a full-time nurse, diabetes and other illnesses. I think that's really important. And I think it could be related to a conversation about the role of health centers in our schools across the city. But I want to back up to, I guess I'll just continue with that very quickly. On school psychologists and social workers that are in our building, do we have an idea of how they're sharing their workload? How much of that is being spent on evaluation versus providing direct services? And then how much of those services could be reimbursable? So we know that some of our the work that social workers and school psychologists provide can be billed to health insurance. That money then gets put into a general fund. Can we look at redirecting that to individual school budgets? Because I think that creates a greater opportunity to make sure that that billing is appropriate and accurate, and that we're following through with it. I'm on the board of my local health center, and we do little case studies and find that a lot of our medical professionals don't always check all the boxes for the services they've provided, so we aren't being reimbursed fully for the services that we're giving. So we could be leaving a lot of money on the table when it comes to reimbursable services. If it were to go back to each individual school community, I think that we'd probably see a more accurate accounting system of those dollar amounts. But I do think it's really important that our behavioral health, mental health specialists are able to provide services and not just do evaluation, in addition to the one full-time nurse. Now, Councillor O'Malley was asking questions about the specific dollar amounts on the budget. Have we looked at we're talking about this increase, we're talking about changes between what was adopted last year and what's proposed for next year, but we haven't considered any overruns in the budget. What do we see as overruns in the current FY18 budget that would actually shrink what this additional investment is?
So we anticipate that the current fiscal year, FY18, we are going to close on budget. We're not going to have any overruns for the current year. There are, as you would expect, every year we do our best to budget, and there are places we end up spending a little more and a little less. As you know, and we've talked about with this body, we are spending more in transportation than we budgeted for, and we're spending a little less in a few other areas like benefits. And so those are offsetting.
So we're offsetting that approximately $6 million from transportation in other areas?
That number, I think, has come down since that last presentation, but yes, we're offsetting it in other areas. Yes.
It just seems like a significant gap to be able to fill, and I can't imagine that there aren't overruns in other departments.
We also have some overruns in FNS, but then we have a longer list of smaller places where we're having a slight surplus versus what we had projected. So the two biggest areas are in benefits and salaries. Our payroll is $700 million. I'm getting the number off the top of my head, but we have had a very slight uptick, especially in the beginning of the year, of our vacancy rate. And with a system of our size, when our vacancy rate goes from being 2% to 2.2, which isn't a reflection of really a difference in the service levels or a policy or anything like that, that as the year goes on, we watch that very closely. Benefits are coming in below projections. Trying to think off the top of my head, the other ones.
Substitutes.
Thank you. Substitutes are coming in a little below, and that is offsetting it.
Okay, that's why I think it would be helpful, and we've talked about this offline, to understand the real dollar spent.
Absolutely.
As opposed to what's just been adopted year after year after year. The vacancy rate within the district, is that classroom teachers? And what are we doing with those? If there's a vacancy with a classroom teacher, it's a full year sub. Are those trained subs or those certified subs? Are we getting, our kids getting a real classroom experience?
So the Office of Human Capital this year actually made a concerted effort to offer more contracts by the 12/1 deadline for long-term leaves. And so part of the reason that we think we're seeing a slight decline in substitutes is because the positions are being filled when they would have remained vacant for the remaining part of the year. And so those circumstances are when we know that the teacher is out on leave for the rest of the year. If it's before a certain date, we'll offer a temporary contract to that employee so that they can have a predictable, high-quality person teaching them for the year. And so they're also doing more management in terms of their subs. I know certain schools are through the new sub system, are being able to identify which subs they want to use on a regular basis so they can call those people in and start to manage the quality of the people coming in to substitute as well.
And that, I know, provides a great deal of consistency to a school when they have the ability to do that. Are we supporting those substitutes, though? And this may be a question either for human capital or somebody else, just to make sure that those subs, although they're getting a contract in a classroom, that they have the supports they need to provide a full experience to our kids.
Yeah, I'll refer that question to Emily and have her address it when she comes.
Great. And then my other follow-up question was Councillor Flynn was talking about outreach to families, and the translation services are great. We need those, and we know that we have 70 languages spoken in BPS. But what about the active work of engaging families, not just sending a translated letter. The outreach that happens through the engagement office, whether it's prior to initial enrollment, but then during our kids while they're in school. How are we engaging families, both English speakers and non-native English speakers, in our school communities?
We are currently going through a reorganization of our office and engagement to prioritize some investments into neighborhood by neighborhood BPS liaisons who will know neighborhoods, know schools, know community partners in their neighborhoods. We're doing some large system initiatives, but we also at the same time need to be supporting schools in their engagement with parents and community as well. So we're actually in the midst of that, and by June 30th, we'll have a new support structure in place in our office engagement, and that work is being led by our Assistant Superintendent of Engagement, Monica Roberts.
That's great, and it really just should be more than engaging parents in a parent or family council and the school site council. Let's be real, true engagement. If you're at school site council and you're getting training on being a member of a school site council, you're already engaged. You're already showing up at school. It's home school visits. It's really engaging families in a meaningful way. I don't know where I am on my time, so I'll ask one more question and then move on. Councilor Siomo had asked about school closures, and I wonder, this is my third budget now, we see an increase in school spending, we're seeing a decline in student enrollment. I'm not a proponent of school closures, but I do know it's a conversation that we have to actively engage in for the future of the district. So whether it's school closures or consolidations, is there a constructive and thoughtful analysis and conversation happening that's, in any ways ready to be a public conversation?
Yes. As part of the Build BPS effort, we will be making some announcements later on this year around an advisory committee that will help us facilitate many of these conversations. This should be around school reconfigurations, because we know we have too many high school and middle school seats, but we need more elementary school seats. And we know that we need to invest in new buildings in particular parts of the city where there is more demand. And we also know that there are some schools that would benefit, some K-5s that would benefit from adding a 6th grade for consistency's sake. And so all that, the next set of engagements will launch at the end of this year.
All right, and I know enrollment drives a lot of those conversations. I just hope when families leave BPS or choose not to enroll in BPS, I hope we're actively engaging them and asking why. So I think it's really important to understand what's missing or what we're not doing to support families so that they either remain or enter BPS.
That's right. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Baker? Morning.
Thank you. Thank you for coming out. Sorry to come late. I missed the presentation. But can you just talk a little bit about Dorchester Academy, what that's going to look like? Where are the students going, teachers, and after that, maybe what it's going to look like for the Fenway, not the Fenway, but the Arts Academy coming over. So a timeline, closure, and how is the Arts Academy coming over? Talk about that a bit, please.
Right. So Dorchester Academy is a level 5 school. It was previously one of our open enrollment schools. When the school went into turnaround status, it was a joint partnership with ABCD to operate the school. It became primarily a school that served our alternative setting students. Many of the students are older students who are far away from graduation. We've seen steady decrease in enrollment in that school over years, and this year, currently we have 16 students left at this school.
16?
16. Many of the students that were enrolled at the beginning of the year actually have graduated. We have a very dedicated group of educators at that school. We're keeping that group of educators together, and they will actually be supporting off-track youth at Excel High School. It was a plan that was co-constructed with the educators at the school. They will be physically located at Excel High School.
And Excel's at South Boston High School?
Correct. and they will be serving off-track youth at that school. There's many off-track youth at Excel High School. The space where Dorchester Academy currently resides, as you mentioned, will be occupied by Boston Arts Academy while that school goes through its construction effort. And so there will be renovations that will be done this year. That school will be co-located with Cash, which is also in that building as well. And plans and have already been in process for that transition for months.
So Cash is on the right side, Arts Academy will be on the left side?
Correct.
When you go in the school, and what do you need to do to get ready for the Arts Academy for next September, well, this September, I guess?
I don't have all the details. We can provide it to you, but I know that some important renovations are needed to ensure that they have the type of space needed for performing arts.
And they'll be there in September?
Correct.
Okay. There was one thing that seems to be happening a lot, and I don't know if it's because we're changing the way we look at that, we're taking care of the facilities. I've gotten some complaints, not a whole lot, about not having money for sort of maintenance budget issues. Are we kind of clamping down at the end of the fiscal year here now are we changing the way we do business? So the maintenance contracts, so normally when the money runs out on the contracts, there is, I don't know if it's supplemental money that's there to be able to allow for repairs that need to happen. And a couple calls, not a whole lot, about no money there for, whether if it's doors that need locks or don't need locks, that sort of stuff. Is there, can you talk about that a little bit, talk to that?
If what you're hearing about specifically refers to locks, our capital...
No, it wasn't.
Okay, because that one is, of course, an area that we've had a lot of interest and attention in recently, and we are making a substantial proposed investment in the capital budget for that for next year. I'm looking at John Hanlon, our COO. Outside of that, I'm not aware of any reduction of service on contracts in our facilities department this year.
Well, with the contracts, in the way I believe they worked or do work, so if a contract is, say, for $1 million for plumbing work, and that million runs out in March,
right?
But there's still plumbing that needs to happen in April, May, and June, there isn't money available for that. I just wanted to, is that the case, or, sorry to bring you down, John?
That's okay, Counselor. So just a couple thoughts on that. These maintenance projects happen through different funding streams. Some, not just the security upgrades that we talked about yesterday, but some are part of the capital budget, in which case there are funding. Those are for specific projects or for other critical repairs that we have capital funds for. For those other day-to-day maintenance problems that I think you're referring to, we do have funds for those. Typically by the end of the school year, by really starting this time of the school year, we start to wind down what we have for funds available. Most of that work happens in the summertime, because you're trying to do as much as you can when school's not in session. And so the lion's share of the funds for maintenance projects are spent during the summer months from July 1st until when school begins. As of now, what we're trying to do is prioritize those projects that are still coming to us through a lens of student safety or staff safety, and other, important projects that really need to be prioritized above others. So there is still funds available. Sometimes we get some requests that maybe aren't as critical as others. Those requests are put more toward the back burner so that we can only spend what we have money for those projects that are truly prioritized.
Okay, thank you. And Joyce, and last, I see a bullet point here about a series of targeted high-impact investments in technology, training, and innovation. And one of them is becoming a man. And then there is the,
Page 22.
22, yeah. So can we talk about a couple of those investments, becoming a man, and then whatever else we have, whatever the other targeted investments are? Can I get somewhat of an understanding of those?
Yeah.
Please.
Becoming a Man is a program that was first designed and implemented in Chicago The research there about the impact it can have on young men of color, they work with some of our most vulnerable students. The research was incredibly compelling, and so we partnered with a number of private funders who wrote some very large checks, which we're appreciative, to bring BAM to Boston. They are in a couple of schools now, and we're expanding to add, I think, 4 more schools to bring us to a total of 6 or 7 for next year. We will have a counselor in each school. They typically work with cohorts that are around 40 to 50 students, I believe, in each school. And it's an intense counseling model, mentorship model to work with at-risk young men of color.
And so it's not a 1 year,
No.
so if a young man is in it in the 3rd grade,
It's high school only.
oh, high school only, okay.
Yep.
Moving on to middle schools, typically young men are in that program for 3 years.
Okay, so like if they start in middle school, it'll be available for 3 years to them?
Our pilot program have been in our high school, so for example, English, the Burke, the O'Brien, and they start in 9th grade. And I've participated in BAM circles, and it is literally a daily intervention for young people.
Okay, and can you talk about Excellence for All?
Mm-hmm.
That's another investment.
Yeah. So we are currently in this school year in the 2nd year of EFA, which I think, as you know, is our 4th, 5th, and will grow to 6th grade program next year. We provide additional resources to the participating schools to increase rigor and enrichment. So students have access to things like world languages, robotics, other professional development for the teachers. And we have been tracking the diversity of the participants, of the students who participate, and we're also, as this program evolves, going to be looking at the academic outcomes. We've succeeded in our first goal, which is making a program that reflects the diversity of the students of Boston Public Schools, and the demographics reflect that, and we have high expectations for what the outcomes will look like as well.
And is that in conjunction with advanced work, or is that in replacing advanced work, or
It is separate from advanced work.
2 separate things?
Yeah, absolutely. The question was asked earlier if the two are a trade-off. They're not. We haven't made any decisions to shut down AWC programs whatsoever. We have been experiencing, and we talked about briefly before, that a few of our AWC programs are experiencing reduced demand. Dr. Chang mentioned that our families are choosing to keep their students in the elementary school where they started and not move them to schools that have AWC, which we think long-term is good for kids.
Yeah.
But what it means is we do have a handful of AWC programs that haven't been attracting enough families to be sustainable.
Okay, thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Chair.
Counselor Janey.
Thank you. So I have a couple of items that I'll just kind of list all at once to make sure I get them all in my time, if that's okay, Mr. Chair. The first thing I wanted to say was, and just building on what Councilor Flaherty said earlier around the charter school reimbursement, I'm glad he brought that up. The first time that I testified before the school committee as a city councilor, that was an issue that I raised, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of making sure that there is some sort of thoughtful, strategic campaign to make sure that Boston gets what Boston needs for our children. A couple of things that I noticed we didn't talk about here that I'd like to hear some thoughts, and then I'm just going to go into some questions. So one, Madison Park, what's the investment in Madison Park High School? I did not see anything here in terms of special education sub-separate and what that means, particularly for Black and Latino boys. I know when you first came to town, Dr. Chang, I sat on your transition team. There was this report done by CCE, and it highlighted that as a big issue, and I'm deeply concerned that that is just falling through the cracks and there's not enough attention to dealing with that population and doing so in a thoughtful way that doesn't just put kids into regular classrooms. You've got to do inclusion the right way. So I want to know what's happening there. Dual language expansion. As you know, I've been a big proponent of making sure that we have more dual language programs, and not just as a strategy for educating English language learners, but just the importance of all children having the opportunity to become fluent in different languages. In terms of building on some of my colleagues said earlier, the Selwell sheet, I think it's page 16, it's 20 positions. How many, are those all FTEs? And then if you could talk about the actual need. So what is the need for having school nurses? And then how does this help us get toward making sure that we're getting to where we need to be? Excellence for All, AWC, many people have asked already. I forget what page that was. Page 20. If you could tell us of the fourth grade class, how many children are not either in Excellence for All or AWC? So I'm interested in who's that third tier that's missing. And then K-1 expansion, again, what is the overall need compared to the demand? How many children are on wait list or want access to K-1 seats and are not getting them? So again, I appreciate the investment, testified again, advocated for the Selwell, for K-1 expansion, et cetera, and I appreciate the investment, but what are the gaps? I'm interested in understanding the gaps. Thank you. That was a lot.
Great. We can start ticking through some of those. I'll say a few things about sub-separate. David, if you want to hit Madison Park after that, that would be great. It was a little bit buried in here, but I mentioned that we have an investment in MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. Actually, as part of our long-term financial planning, I sat in front of the school committee and I projected a slide that showed similar data to the report you're referring to that showed the disproportionate placement of boys of color in sub-separate classrooms and with specific disabilities. And as we think about long-term financial planning, it's not just about saving money, it's about saying, where are we spending our money today and is it having the best impact? And I'm not sure, as we sat there and had that conversation, that any of us felt like spending these huge sums of money to have boys in color in these sub-separate classrooms was what any of us wanted from an economic or academic or equity point of view. In response to the work we did, we were partnering very closely with special education, and they wanted to marry inclusion with prevention. And so we have invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in what the special education team called MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, which is about meeting kids where they're at in pre-K, K, first, second grades before they get an IEP, before they end up in a sub-separate classroom. And we bought curriculum, and we've been doing training and professional development for teachers. We're trying to get coverage of as many classrooms and teachers across the district as we can. We're making pretty good progress. And the tools that we're providing in that investment are both on literacy and social emotional supports, because those are the two reasons that the team identified which were most likely the triggers that ended up with a student getting an IEP and eventually ending up in a sub-separate placement. So I just wanted to say how strongly we agree with the sentiment there. We'll be entering into our second year of this concerted effort on prevention. And when our asset team, that's what we call our academic special education teams, are sitting here for their hearing, I'm sure they would love to go into more detail and they can be more eloquent than I can on the efforts there.
I think you did a good job. One thing I would add is this year we created we actually restarted the inclusion task force and made it a superintendent's working group. And so we have educators, we have activists, we have leaders all at the table to help us expand inclusion appropriately throughout the district.
David, do you want to take Madison Park?
Madison Park is projected to have a slight decrease in enrollment for next year. There's some good news in that, which is sort of the decreasing enrollment in Madison Park appears to have slowed. They were seeing much more significant decreases in years prior. That decrease is offset slightly by an increase in need at the school. So actually funding is up. The number of FTE is flat, even as enrollment has decreased very slightly, projected to decrease by about 23 students for next year.
David, not to put you on the spot, but do you happen to have those numbers you pulled for our press inquiry on our spending for Madison Park?
You know, I can.
That we had
I
a
can
press
pull them
inquiry
together.
about, I'll give the high level while David.
I
Oh,
can
If you don't have
got
it now,
Okay.
I'd love
Yeah,
to
we
see
can,
it.
we can forward some of the information. One of the questions we get asked often is to compare Madison Park to a regional vocational technical school. In a lot of other parts of the state, we don't see sort of in-district vocational schools like we have here in Madison Park. You see these regional schools that are pulling together students from across multiple districts to do vocational education. Minuteman is an example of one. There's a school in Worcester. There's a number of them across the state. One of the challenges is they all operate as their own LEA, their own school district of just one school typically. And so when we look at their budget on the state website, it includes things like benefits costs, transportation costs, other things that if you look at Madison Park's budget, you don't see. So we tried to do a comparison early in the year to see how does Madison Park's budget stack up with about, I think I was able to pull 26 regional vocational technical schools from across the state. And our estimate was Madison Park was probably about the second or third highest funded of all of those schools. So, you know, we are still committed to Madison Park. We give them a supplemental beyond the vocational. So it's a vocational ed weight in weighted student funding that every student at Madison Park receives.
Which is $4,500 per pupil. I want to make clear quite the size of it. It's quite substantial.
Yep. And then on top of that, there's additional support to Madison Park to maintain the breadth of vocational programs, even though not all of those programs currently have the demand to keep the program full. Under weighted student funding, they would be funded, but as enrollment has declined, especially in some programs, we're seeing decreased need. We're keeping some of those programs open with additional funding. There's also the Rocks Map partnership, which is run by, by Madison Park, which gives students at Madison Park access to community colleges in Boston, I believe RCC and Bunker Hill, to begin associate's level coursework while they're still in high school.
So the bottom line is that I think we all know there's work we want to still accomplish at Madison Park, but our financial commitment and investment there is substantial. And, you know, I certainly think we can have ongoing conversations about whether that money's been spent the right way, but I feel confident that we are investing significantly in Madison Park.
And you should get your card detailed there.
Just
Yeah.
a second, kind of getting in the weeds here on individual schools. We're going to have many hearings to discuss individual school budgets and funding vocational ed, which is all very important. But I just caution everybody, we're trying to stay at this level and not get so much into the weeds.
Okay. If you could speak to the K-1.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that. We've worked closely with the mayor and his team on a study of what it means to have great, excellent early education in Boston. And as you may have heard folks say before, we think we have a quality issue, not an access issue. And so we're working very hard to have a long-term plan that every four-year-old in the city can have access to a high-quality K-1 seat, whether it's in BPS or elsewhere. This year represents the first year in a couple of years where we haven't made big strides in the number of our K-1 seats in BPS, and that's in part because we need to figure out some space needs first. We need space in the neighborhoods and in the schools where kids want to go, and so we need to make some progress on Build BPS to free up the space to continue our K-1 expansion within BPS.
But if you could speak to the need, so
Yeah.
for the families who apply for K-1 seats and then don't get a seat, how does that demand then compare to what's available?
Do you have those numbers, Nate?
I don't have the total numbers, though. We can get the demand. One way that we look at the demand for K-1 is in comparison to K-2 and then grade 1. So we have right now roughly 3,000 students being served in K-1 seats. The number of K-2 students is 4,200. So you see an increase of about 1,300 seats. So one way to measure is we would need an additional 1,300 seats to be able to serve all the kids. Although we also see an increase in the number of students who are looking to enroll in BPS at grade 1. And the reason you see that is K2 is universal, meaning everyone can have access to it. They're guaranteed a K2 seat. Grade 1 is the first year in which school is required, so you have to be enrolled in school by December of the year you turn 6. So you see a jump of kids each year, somewhere between 5 and 10% of students who increase their participation. Basically what we see is families, not all families will choose K1. I know from my experience, a number of families that I talk to and friends of mine who think that a full day K1 program for their kid at 4 years old is a lot for their students, so they want to wait. So we think we need somewhere, if we were to serve everyone in BPS who's demanding a BPS seat, somewhere around 4,000 seats was the original estimate. Though, as Eleanor mentioned, we're not looking to necessarily serve all students in BPS seats. We're looking at partnering with community-based partnerships, and we're also doing a pilot program this year to start to align the K1 partner programs with BPS schools for enrollment so that families can get some of what they want, which is the predictability in their enrollment for their students, but also maintaining their community-based programs. So they don't feel like they're missing out on access to some high-quality schools or to any of their schools by not enrolling in K1, which I know is something that people fear, right? Get in at K1, or you might miss some of our schools because it's the entry grade for those schools. So there are multiple ways that we're looking at it, and multiple ways we're trying to partner with community-based partnerships to both strengthen those high-quality programs, increase predictability for families, and serve families in the setting that they're looking for.
Thanks. Councilor Flynn?
Our colleges and universities provide many scholarships to BPS graduates. What is, when a student is in college, what is the graduation rate for those students?
The last set of data that we received was for the cohort graduating from 2014. Graduation rate within 6 years in college was 52%.
Is that a success?
48% are not, so I wouldn't say so, but when you look at how that trends nationally, it's pretty impressive.
Okay. I was with Councilor Baker early this morning at a substance abuse public safety meeting in South Boston, surrounded by 2 public housing developments, Mary Ellen McCormick, Old Colony, West Broadway was right down the street, but I was thinking of what services do we have for students, public school students, in developments, knowing that there's an opiate crisis right in the middle of their front yard, backyard, in their hallway. How can you effectively study when you see a crisis like that around you? What's BPS doing in that regard?
So our wellness department is part of our CEL, social emotional learning and wellness umbrella, and there is we actually collect risk data every single year, and then we use that data to help us triangulate where support needs to get. Any young person or family that needs support on such issues will be able to access not only services within schools, but we also have partner organizations we work with. And so it is an issue. It's something that it's data we looked at annually within BPS.
I guess my final question, I was over Villa Victoria this weekend talking to some young people, asked them what their plans were for the summer. They didn't have any. No summer camp, no educational program, no sports program that they were participating in. And then I represented parts of Beacon Hill and Back Bay, and they had excellent camps, summer camps they were going to. What can we do to make sure that those in public housing, those in low-income areas have access to the same educational programs, sports programs as wealthy kids? As Councilor Janey was highlighting, there needs to be some equity making sure that kids in public housing or kids in low income also have the same benefits as wealthier kids.
Absolutely is an equity issue. Boston Public Schools partners with Boston After School and Beyond to provide high-quality after-school and summer programming, especially focused in neighborhoods that need it the most. We actually are a national model in this area. We received a Wallace grant to implement high-quality programming. We have what we call the fifth quarter, which is a collaboration between Boston Public Schools and community programs that will continue the learning from the school year into the summer. And these summer programs are a mix of academics and high-quality enrichments. Over 12,000 young people are served in Boston Public Schools during the summer. 2,200 of them are served in these really high-quality, high-intense support programs, and they're all focused in our most needy neighborhoods. We will continue growing that effort because the research is showing that young people that get this sort of programming don't see the summer melt that other students are experiencing. So especially in areas of math, they are able to kind of maintain math achievement as they move into the next school year.
And I won't ask any more questions, but I just want to relay one question if someone on the next panel could address it. The future of South Boston High School, how is it doing? If someone could respond at a later time. And also, just one final comment. I was with you, Superintendent. We visited the Carter School several months ago, and as you know, it's an excellent program. I know they're building a swimming pool there, and it's really a highlight. Visiting that school, seeing the hard work of the teachers and staff, educating special education students. Why do you think that school is so successful?
Well, I actually just spoke to the principal of the school this morning. You have a staff and leadership at that staff that understand that those young people have gifts, and they have really put a commitment on making sure that those young people actually are engaged in rigorous tasks that they are able to access. And it's a school I've visited 4 or 5 times in my time in the last 3 years, and it's a school that always inspires. And hopefully, in working with MSBA, we will be able to do an expansion of that school, serve more young people who are medically fragile in the city of Boston as opposed to having them bus to other neighborhoods, and then create that therapeutic pool that you were referring to, because those young people literally travel 40 minutes to access a pool once a week currently.
Right, the school is not in my district, but whatever I can do to be helpful to that school, please let me know.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Sabi George?
Thank you. And I'll be quick here, because I know we have a number of other hearings that will get to some of the weeds. I was looking through some of my old notes from the last 2 budgets, and we had spent some time talking about long-range plans for our school libraries. I wonder if you could just touch on what the plan is for our school libraries, both schools that have them and have a librarian, schools that have libraries that don't have librarians, schools that don't have library services at all.
We collect, and I can share with you, data on both the physical presence of which schools have them and the staffing of where we have librarians. This has been a hot topic, as I think you know, and we have a combination of that we have some schools, I think, who would like a librarian who don't have it because they don't have the resources. And then we have other schools who could afford a librarian but have made a different instructional choice. They believe they want their resources elsewhere. This was a issue that the budget equity team grappled with extensively. And we heard from principals who had elected to use their resources differently. We had school leaders who had decided not to staff a librarian, but had a laptop in every classroom and thought they had dispersed what a library would do in that one visit a week for their elementary school students and they had integrated it into the school day. We had a high school that had declined to have a librarian in favor of having 3 library paraprofessionals so that the library could be open from the crack of dawn until late at night. So it was a centerpiece for the school, and students could always be coming in and out. And after hearing from those school leaders and debating it, we decided that this was one of those areas where we need to make sure our job is to put as much money and as much discretionary power in the hands of our school leaders as possible. And we shied away from dictating that we want someone whose title is librarian in every school. This is an issue where I will say there are people on both sides of it, but in this year's budget, we added $10 million more of money into the hands of school leaders and school communities to make these kinds of investments. And we opted to do that rather than say, we want to track towards having a full-time librarian in every school. I would say, sorry for the long-winded answer, I'll just finish by saying, this is different than nurses.
Yes.
Nurses, I think there is something about the FTE that has that title, and it is the responsibility of the central office to figure out the funding to get us there over the long term.
I agree. And I think your comments about discretion, and Councilor Flaherty talked about discretion, and I support school autonomy, but sometimes we use that word discretion. Really, it almost sometimes becomes the rock when we put school leaders, between the rock and the hard place with making certain decisions. So we've got to be really careful
Yes.
about discretion or passing sort of the difficult decisions on that then really very directly impact our kids in their school experience. And then lastly, I know that we'll talk about it in a further hearing about inclusion and the inclusion model of the city and moving schools towards really an all-inclusive model, which I think on paper and in theory I support, but I think that we've lost sort of the impact. We haven't looked very directly or clearly at the impact that having inclusion across the district provides or causes when we use a weighted student formula and when we have open seats, and what does that mean for school communities? What does that mean for how many teachers are in a classroom? And duly certified teachers don't equal 2 teachers, and having appropriately trained paras and support professionals in classrooms is really important. And we don't have to go into inclusion today because I know that we've got a hearing specific to it later on.
All I was going to say is there is an inclusion working group that I'm actually on that's focused on answering these questions. We're still working, but I just wanted to let you know that it includes structural questions about budget, enrollment, and human capital, as well as the programmatic questions of what are the models of service we want to need, what are the professional development resources available, and it includes both school leaders, outside stakeholders, and central office staff.
Great. And then last but not least, because it is not, I think, it could be under the Opportunity Index section, but I've received a lot of phone calls about Playworks, Tenacity, and Boston Debate League in our schools. And the challenge with the Opportunity Index is where it feels like to many school communities that we're punishing school communities that have proactively built relationships and gotten investment, as opposed to bringing everyone else up to that level of funding where sort of taking from one to give to another, where we've really got to get people on a more equal footing, not just taking away from schools that have. So there's this feeling of punishment. And my own boys who are going into the 7th grade are looking forward to Boston Debate League, and they're excited about it. And my boys don't get excited about much that isn't sports related. So I really, I do want to impress upon you the importance that Playworks, Tenacity, and Boston Debate League really play, in addition to a lot of other programs in the city. That's it.
Thanks. Councilor Janey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all again for being here. I want to echo the comments that Councilor Asabi George made earlier on inclusion. Very important that we do that right. My earlier questions on dual language expansion, excellence for all, I can wait for the hearings. I know we've got I think they're both being covered under the Opportunity and Achievement Gap hearing, so I'll wait for that. But I was interested in learning more about the Office of School Safety. You said it was established 2 years ago. Want to understand what kind of issues are coming up there, and just want to be very clear that this I want to understand whether or not this is dealing with some of the safety issues that have come up here in terms of making sure that our buildings are safe when we have to go into safe mode or anything happens, and it's not a way to kind of over-police our children. So I just want to understand what issues are coming up, what the mission of the office is, et cetera.
You're absolutely right. We're not law enforcement. We support young people and keep our young people safe.
Any issues that are coming up?
Oh,
and what
issues
is the
that are coming
mission
in.
of the office?
It's about coordination and working across agencies to make sure young people are coming to and from school safely, that young people are safe in schools, that they have safe and welcoming environments in our schools. It is to make sure that when families do need additional services, those can be provided to them. When there are issues that involve law enforcement, they actually can serve as a buffer and to make sure that we're following all the proper protocols. We are not in the realm of law enforcement. We are in the realm of supporting young people. Kim Pelotru leads that office. She has years and years of experience in this area, and we formed this office to make sure all that was happening.
Thank you.
So
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Council Flaherty?
What, if any, in this budget is included to deal with, I guess, parental accountability? So our focus is obviously on the children, but like everything else, sometimes parents aren't operating on all cylinders. You might have a couple that might be out to lunch, and that impacts the children and/or the interaction with the school. But I think parents also need to be held accountable for holding teachers and principals accountable. We're trying to provide the best opportunity for our youth and for our children, but sometimes I don't think we necessarily deal with sort of the problem parents, and our hope is that there's not lots of them, but in those instances where there are, I tend to seem to think in just dealing with constituents issues that they kind of get a free pass and we sort of take a hands off on that. And I think we need to go on the offense and start holding parents accountable as well. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on parental accountability, but I'd like to hear them.
Yeah, I think as Boston Public Schools, we see parents as authentic partners with us, and when they're, as we know, young people who have immense needs, and we're there to support them. But we also have many of our parents who are dealing with circumstances of poverty and dealing with trauma in their own lives. And while they may not always seem like they're a regular presence, I know that I've never met a parent that hasn't completely loved their young person. Our Office of Engagement has many programs to support parents. I speak at every parent university, visit with parents at home. It is, actually we're regularly looked at nationally as a strong model for how you work alongside parents. But what I'm hearing is like given everything that's going on in our society, especially in our urban centers, many of the adults also need support as well. I think the opportunity here is working closely with our city partners to help support not only young people but families in partnership. And actually we're beginning many of those conversations with our new Chief of Health and Human Services, Marty Martinez, because I think this is an area of opportunity for us.
Okay. Very good. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councilor Savi George.
I just wanted to add, 'cause I meant to do it at the beginning of the hearing, but just wanted to thank Chairman Siomo, the superintendent, and the students of the Boston Student Advisory Council who will be, throughout the course of these hearings, participating, I think, in a very productive way in our hearings, and they'll have an opportunity to testify just after the panel, prior to our questions, to share their thoughts about the particular topics. And if they aren't able to attend and want to present, Kerry has been great enough to accept a video presentation from them. So I look forward to that and hearing from the kids.
Great.
Thank
All
you.
set? Everybody good? All right. Great. Thank you very much for your time and testimony. We're going to adjourn this hearing, take a break, and we have the revolving funds to go through. So let's say 10, 15 minutes. Is that good for
Perfect.
everybody? Great. Thank you.
Thank you,
This
counselors.
hearing is adjourned. Thank you.
So I meant to start with that.
Brighton District City Councilor. Today is Tuesday, April 24th. We are here for this segment of the BPS hearings to review the 3 revolving funds associated with the Boston Public Schools. Dockets 0573, 0574, and 0575. Docket 0573, message and order authorizing a limit for the Boston Public Schools revolving fund for fiscal year 2019 to support the maintenance and repair for BPS facilities, including custodial and utility costs for extended building time, floor refinishing, landscaping, building repairs, receipts from lease, permit for use, and parking fees for BPS facilities will be deposited in the fund. BPS will be the only unit authorized to expend from the fund. Such expenditures shall not exceed $2,600,000. Docket 0574, message and order authorizing a limit for the Boston Public Schools revolving fund for fiscal year 2019 to repair and purchase Boston Public Schools computer technology, including computers, mobile devices, and instructional services. This revolving fund shall be credited with any and all receipts from equipment sales and repair fees for Boston Public Schools technology. Receipts and resulting expenditures from this fund shall not exceed $1,500,000. And docket 0575. Message and order authorizing a limit for the Boston Public Schools revolving fund for fiscal year 2019 for Boston Public School transportation costs, including bus and public transportation costs. This revolving fund shall be credited with revenue received by Boston Public Schools Department for the provision of transportation to groups and entities for field trips and activities other than transportation to and from school. Receipts and resulting expenditures from this fund shall not exceed $125,000. I'd like to remind folks this is a public hearing that is being broadcast and recorded on RCN Channel 82, Comcast 8, and Verizon 1964. I'd ask folks to silence their electronic devices. The conclusion of the question and answers from my colleagues and the presentation from the department, we will take public testimony. There's a sign-in sheet to my left. Please write down your name, affiliation, and residence, and check off the box if you wish to testify publicly. In order of their arrival, my colleagues, City Councilor at Large Michael Flaherty, District City Councilor Ed Flynn, to my right, Councilor Kim Janey, and to my left, Councilor at Large Anissa Sabi George. I'd like to welcome Nate and David back to present these 3 revolving funds.
Thank you, Councilor. I won't say much. I just want to note that the authorization of the revolving funds is a separate authorization from our budget, so we appreciate your consideration for the 3 revolving funds put in front of you as described. The revolving funds are authorized under Chapter 44, Section 53E.5, that allows us to collect revenue into this account and then expend it for the specified purposes. That does not include positions and salary, though in some cases we use overtime as part of the facilities fund for custodians who are keeping buildings open later for specific activities. The 3 funds that we've identified here, the facilities fund, as you mentioned, are for permits. The funds are then used for projects to maintain buildings. The technology fund, which is our primary mechanism for doing our sale of laptops. So as you know, we have the Laptop for Learner program that provides laptops for teachers. Every 3 years, we do a refresh As part of that, we sell our existing laptops, collect the revenue, and then use it to help purchase the next fleet of laptops. And then the third is for field trips for our transportation department. This just gives us flexibility. These are 3 revolving funds that we've had for several years, at least as long as I've been associated with the budget. We're asking to be able to continue and maintain these programs. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you for questions.
Great. I know we lease some parking, we lease buildings. Do you have a kind of an inventory of the typical parking lots and/or facilities that we're getting rent from?
The parking lots that the primary parking lot is the one at the McKinley that is part of the, for Red Sox games. It's an opportunity for us to collect revenue for parking spots afterwards. I'm not sure that there are other lots that we are currently leasing. Most of our lots are available to residents after hours, as long as they're out in time for schools to arrive the next day. For facilities, the lease facilities, we were just talking about one, the Hamilton building in Brighton, as you know, is one of our lease facilities, leased to a Jewish school currently. I can get a full list of the facilities that are leased.
Yeah, that would be helpful. I know, several years ago when we had over 25 closings / consolidations, that the Hamilton being one of them, my neighborhood benefited greatly from the pursuit by the Dorchester Academy, and it's been a great facility for them, for the neighborhood. It's really drawn a lot of families to that neighborhood in particular, so great that it's being used at least for some education purpose anyway. Councilor Flaherty.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So do we have the exact number of BPS facility rentals? I know we just mentioned one that's over near Fenway Park, but have to assume that there are others, and can you describe what they are?
You mean the rentals in terms of the parking lots?
Yeah, parking lots or any other, I don't know, gyms, pools. I mean, you tell me if we rent them.
Yeah, so there's a number of facilities that are used for a lot of different purposes. I know the Irving auditorium is leased on Sunday for a church to use it. The after-school programs come in and use space, different sports leagues. So we could pull the number of permits that have been requested.
Yeah, just like
for facilities to be able to use our facilities for any purpose throughout the year.
Yep. Yeah, I would like a list of all BPS facility rentals, facilities that are rented, who rents these facilities, and what we typically charge for a rental. And then, I guess in the same token, I guess is the types of repairs and maintenance that also have to take place at those facilities, whether it's striping the parking lot or repairs to the rim of a basketball court in a school, whatever. So, and then I guess, and then the funds, the revolving funds, are those funds used to support the maintenance of these facilities, or is that something completely different? Does that come out of capital for the actual school facility?
So I think our overall, when we think of how do we keep our buildings up to date, there are the 3 different sources. The capital projects are the large projects where we're modernizing or refurbishing a particular part of a building. We talked about the hearing yesterday. Operating, we do have also our maintenance contracts that do plumbing. It came up at one point today as well. And then there's the revolving fund, which allows us to collect these fees from people who are using the facilities, either on an ongoing basis or on it could be an ad hoc event that a school is happening at a school. That money is then used for different projects to do maintenance, so either refinishing courts, basketball courts, or doing maintenance on the building to sort of, the idea is that it's as we lease out these, or as we let people use our buildings, there's wear and tear that's above normal use, and this allows us to collect the revenue to offset that.
Gotcha. And then would you have a list of requests that have been denied? Say, for example, someone wants to use one of our parking lots for, say, a church group or a neighborhood that has, densely populated, that has a major parking issue that they'd like to use a school facility to maybe park vehicles. So I'd also, in conjunction, I guess, with the list of active facility rentals, I assume that you must keep a running list of those that may have made a request, but it was either denied for a specific reason, and then maybe as members of the city council, we could maybe help kind of connect the dots. Maybe it's something that the community group needs to do or is not aware of, that we can create an additional partnership to help maybe grow, that opportunity.
I can request that from the facilities department as well.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Counselor Flynn.
Thank you, Council Siomo. I had, I guess, two questions as it relates to rentals. So if a private organization wants to rent the school auditorium, they pay for that, of course, but does that money go back into the school, or does it go back into BPS?
So in this case, when they request a permit, the payment comes into the revolving account that would be authorized by this body, and then the money would be used to help maintain the buildings. And we do try, so sometimes it's a small fee and a one-time use. So it's not like we collect $200 for an event and then we immediately try and find $200 to do repairs on that specific building. But we do try and, if a building is in use and is because of the use getting more wear and tear, that we do try and reinvest in those buildings.
Into that school specifically?
Into that school. And so what we're trying to do, and I think this is part of the larger Build BPS effort as well, is to look across our buildings and make decisions not based on either the school communities that are the loudest or the school communities that maybe raise the right money. What we want to do is look at the need of the buildings and be able to allocate our resources to maintain all of our buildings so we can set both a minimum and a higher threshold. So that it's an equity-based, it's a broad-based approach to make sure all of our buildings are in good condition, not just the ones that happen to be popular for community events.
I understand that. My concern is that a school is renting it out to a private organization. There's custodians that are there. That money comes out of that school's budget.
Oh,
but basically, and there's wear and tear on the school itself, and it seems like the school specifically doesn't get anything in return.
I'm glad you brought up the custodian part. For custodians are all budgeted centrally, and they're allocated out to schools. And that's part of what we consider the school services budgeted centrally, so that custodians and custodial overtime is not a charge that's directly hitting a school. So if somebody rents out South Boston High and we need to pay a custodian overtime, which we would to make sure the building's open and to clean up after the event, that school doesn't incur that charge for the custodian. And then the cleaning that happens after the event that the custodian needs to do would not be charged to the school. It's the overtime of that employee that would be paid out of the revolving fund.
Exactly right.
Okay, I guess my final question. If a private organization is using a school and paying into the BPS to use it, could some of that funding go back to the school to address any ADA compliance issues? I've seen teachers at certain schools, lifting students in wheelchairs, and because the theater stage is not in compliance. But can we use some of that money, whether it's to build a ramp or to make it easier for disabled students to access, all parts of the school?
I just want to, you're emphasizing an importance on ADA compliance, and we, as part of Build BPS, did an assessment of all of our buildings for ADA compliance, and now we know which of our schools have more or less compliant buildings. I think that's something that we need to continue to invest in. Also wanted to highlight as an example of the sort of revenue sharing that you might be talking about, for the McKinley School parking, we have an agreement about the costs. Some of the revenue goes directly to the school to be able to benefit the school and part of their operating budget, and then some of the money goes to the facilities team to be able to maintain, to do maintenance work as well. So that's an example of money that is redirected to the school. The overall request to think about using these fees as a way to increase ADA compliant. We don't have an explicit tie of the revenue that's generated to a particular program stream, but I can note that and talk with the facilities department, and when we start thinking about Build BPS and investments in facilities overall, thinking about potentially tying certain revenue streams to certain initiatives within Build BPS for ADA compliance, for example.
Yeah, that's very important to me, to make sure every school is ADA compliant, and if they're not, I understand that, but we need to work harder and make sure we invest the right amount of money to make sure every aspect of that school is ADA compliance. Thank you.
Thanks. Counselor Savage?
I actually don't have any questions, thank you.
Great. Well, thanks. That concludes the revolving fund hearing. I don't know if Kim Janey wanted to come back, but this hearing is adjourned.